It's wonderful to see such an array of faces. I'm Liz Peace. I have the great good fortune to be the chair of the Church's Conservation Trust and have been for, quite a few years now, I think about 3. And prior to that, I was involved in the CCT as a trustee. So I feel I've been on a long journey with the CCT. The reason I'm still there is because I think it's a fabulous organisation, and I'm sure most of you here tonight will feel the same, because that's why you've come along to support us. This is our annual big event in London. We call it our annual lecture. It's actually the, if I get this right, the Candida Lycett Green Memorial Lecture. Candida was a passionate champion of historic English churches, and she was actually a former vice president of the Church's Conservation Trust, and we feel that honouring her memory is hugely appropriate. Tonight is going to be, I think, a really special evening. I'm not going to say too much about it because our next speaker is going to introduce our main speaker, but I'm sure a lot of you are here because you want to hear Simon Jenkins and what he has to say. And I was teasing him earlier about his Wikipedia entry, which of course lists all the controversial things he's ever written, which just shows you that he doesn't hang back. So, and I'm sure he's not going to tonight either. But I'm not going to say a great deal other than to say you are all very, very welcome, and we're delighted to see so many of you here. A lady called Victoria Jenner is actually going to be our sort of MC for the real heart of the evening. Now, Victoria is an award-winning researcher, an interpretation producer in heritage. She's been involved with the National Trust, with the Bodleian, with the Ashmolean, which sounds quite an impressive record. But the really interesting thing from our perspective is that she curates and manages our series of members' lectures. Now, I don't know how many of you listen to those. I always miss them. They're on a Monday evening and it's just at an inconvenient time. But if you're a member, you can access them on our website, on our digital CCT website. And it's great to listen to those when you're doing other things, the gardening, mowing the lawn, in the gym or whatever. You can catch up on this wonderful eclectic series of lectures. So that's a great incentive to become a member of the CCT, and we have Victoria to thank for putting such a wonderful selection of subjects together. So I'm not going to say any more for now. You'll get a bit more from me later on. I'm going to hand over to Victoria, who's going to talk about Simon and what he's going to talk about. Victoria, over to you.
Thank you so much, Liz, for a wonderful introduction. Hello, everyone. Good evening. Welcome to St. Andrew's Church, the ideal setting for tonight's lecture and a perfect symbol of resilience. So, St. Andrew's Church, Holborn, stands as a testament to the centuries of societal change it has witnessed and survived. From its first mention in 959 AD, when it was a wooden structure perched above the River Fleet, to its transformation under Sir Christopher Wren in the late 17th century, this church has been both a place of worship and a hub of local life. It was spared during the Reformation and even escaped the destruction of the Great Fire of London, yet by the late 1600s it needed extensive rebuilding, and this is when Wren's design made it so transformative it became the largest of its parish churches, a mark of its significance. And then over the centuries it became entwined with the lives of notable figures. So the 3rd Earl of Southampton, Henry Wriothesley, the godson of Henry VIII and patron to William Shakespeare. And he was baptised here. And then we also have the pioneering scientist, Christopher Merry, who was laid to rest in its grounds. Then during the Civil War, the rector, John Hackett, defied Roundhead soldiers in an act of quiet rebellion, a moment that speaks to the church's role as a place of courage and conviction. Then even in the 19th century, we see the church continue to serve as a place for social change. Dr. William Marsden's discovery of a dying girl in the churchyard led to the founding of the Royal Free Hospital. So here we are finding time and time again, St Andrews has adapted to the needs of its community very remarkably, serving as both a spiritual and a social anchor. Its history has been intertwined with the lives of the people it served, and I think this is a key point to raise in this evening's lecture and Q&A later on. But St Andrews isn't just a relic of the past, no, it serves today and thrives as an active guild church, offering worship in the Catholic tradition and serving as a beacon of support for charities, helping those in need across South Camden and the City of London. So this church, in all of its historical richness, remains a living, breathing part of its community. And tonight, rather fittingly, our focus is on the future of such churches that equally hold important stories. 25 years after Sir Simon Jenkins published England's 1,000 Best Churches, the crisis in maintaining these remarkable buildings has worsened. What can we do about it? That's the pressing question we are here to discuss tonight. So I urge you all to contribute to our Q&A session later. Put on your thinking caps throughout the lecture and be brave and raise your hand. Now, the moment we have all been waiting for. It is my great honour to introduce our speaker for the evening, Sir Simon Jenkins, a renowned broadcaster, journalist and former chair of the National Trust. Simon's passion for historic churches is well known. You will most likely have at least one of Simon's celebrated Penguin books in your bookcase at home, whether that be England's 1,000 Best Churches, England's Cathedrals, and Europe's 100 Best Cathedrals, works that have drawn countless visitors to these treasures of architecture and history. If you have all of these and wish to add to your collection, then please do pre-order Simon's most recent publication, A Short History of British Architecture from Stonehenge to the Shard. Then, in addition to his writing for The Guardian, The Times and The Evening Standard, Simon has been a steadfast advocate for the preservation of these churches, serving on the Board of Trustees for the Churches Conservation Trust, since 2016, and in 2004 he was knighted for his services to journalism, and we are fortunate to have his insight and hear his personal views tonight on what can be done to save our churches. So please join me in welcoming Sir Simon Jenkins.
I'm delighted to be here in anything that's sponsored by Candida Lycett Green, who I knew a little, but whose father, John Betchman, was, as I'm about to explain, very much the inspiration for my book and my interest in architecture and churches in particular. So it's a real honour to be here talking to you tonight in her name. I start with a short story which is relevant to dear Betchman. I was leaving the British Museum once, many years ago, coming down the steps, and a Japanese couple came up to me and they said to me, "Excuse me, sir, could you please tell me where the British Museum is?" And I said, "You just left it." And they said, no, we're looking for the British Museum. In a very precise Japanese way. And I said, "This is the British Museum, you've just been in it." They said, no, sir, this is not the British Museum. I said, "What is it?" He said, "This is the Egyptian Museum, the Greek Museum, it's the Roman Museum, it's the European Museum. There's nothing British in it. Where's the British Museum?" And I rather floundered, and I said, "Well, there's the V&A Museum." They said, no, that's the Victoria and Albert Museum. We're looking for the British Museum. They stormed off. They were very upset. It happened at the time that I was driving Betchman around churches in the southeast, most in the London area, wonderfully mischievous in all his attitudes to them. But I did ask, I said to him and said, "Where do you think the British Museum is?" And he thought a bit and he said, "It's the parish church. And it's everywhere." And it deeply moved me. And we went on to explore, in my time with him, 40 or 50 churches. And I became completely addicted to them. But it was that perception about a parish church that was so perceptive. His great sort of friend and rival in many ways, Alec Clifton Taylor, I don't know how many of you remember Clifton Taylor, would approach a church almost with a magnifying glass. He said, "Where's this stone from? Where's this wood from?" what's this church made of? Betjeman would approach a church completely differently. He'd open the door, he'd go in, he'd gasp. He'd look up, he'd throw his hands around, he'd kneel down in sort of ritual prayer to the church, and then immediately start to explain in great detail some wonderful fact about it. But it was Betjeman's approach to the church that, although I'm not a churchgoer, I'm not a practicing Christian, but he filled me with awe for these buildings, and that stayed with me ever since. So I'm very proud to be here, in Candida's name at least, to be talking to you tonight. I think the origins of the book, at least, were when Betjeman died. I was asked to update his famous Collins Guide to English Parish Churches, which many of you will know. There were hundreds of them in that book, almost unusable, about which correspondents had sent him details because he didn't know these churches. He didn't visit them all in the book. But I felt that I owed it to Betjeman's memory to do a book which arose out of his book. Although he starred 1,000 of them in it, they weren't the 1,000 I then chose, because he hadn't been to all of them, but I had been to mine, I have to say. It did become something of an ordeal. Drifting through Herefordshire Vale on a summer afternoon was lovely. Traipsing around a dank Manchester suburb in a wet winter evening was not. And I can confess that at about 750 churches, I was ready to give up. I persevered, and the 1,000 Best was published. It was published, I have to say, a quarter of a century ago this month. So we're celebrating slightly that anniversary. I may say the then Archbishop of Canterbury, George Carey, very kindly gave a launch party for the book in Lambeth Palace. In the course of his speech, he was quite mischievous. He said to me, you claim to be not a practicing Christian. How many churches did you go to? So I said, I think I probably went to about 2,000 churches in the end. You went to 2,000 churches? I said, yes, I did. He said, you mean to tell me none of it rubbed off? And it stopped me in my tracks, rather, because the fact is that something did. And that's really why I'm here today. What does rub off from a parish church, even if you're not a practicing Christian? And many people who go to churches aren't. And I think it was an awareness of all that these places had meant to their communities down the centuries. And you can feel it, or I could feel it when I entered a church. It wasn't that I believed in it, it was that I was aware of the presence of all these people and their memories, and how important it was to them. And I've just felt this could not be ignored, and I think it cannot now be ignored and sacrificed on the altar of church redundancy, which is what I'm going to talk about. I have to admit, there was something about the book I did regret. It's the last thing I'll mention about the book, which is that apart from the mistakes in it, and there are quite a few of those, and I haven't corrected them, I'm afraid, I was unsure about starring churches out of 5. Betjeman did 1 star, I did 5. I think it was a mistake. I discovered you can insult someone's town, you can insult their profession, you can probably even insult their family. But if you give their St. Mary's 1 star less than St. Andrew's down the road, all hell breaks loose. The number of letters I got saying, explain yourself, how dare you, I gave up. But in the introduction to the book, I remember on being surprised at how few of the 1,000, really how very few, were in a truly bad state of repair. I honestly would say there were more than a dozen of my 5-star churches, or certainly my leading churches. Churches were surviving on the fierce determination with thousands of members to keep them up and running. Be it a rich lord of the manor or a savage bring and buy sale, somehow the roofs were kept on. Many, I'm proud to say, are now with the CCT. Others received help from the National Churches Trust, English Heritage, and the Friends of Friendless Churches. It was regarded as a rather contradictory title. If you're a friend of a friendless church, it's no longer friendless. Anyway, there we are. But that was then. Today, all is different. I hate the much abused word crisis, but you all know the figures. A truly alarming number of parish churches are either literally or virtually closed. Estimates vary. Since the INS report of 2015, but between 3,000 and 5,000 of 16,000 parish churches are now disused or effectively so. That's an awful lot, approaching a third. They are no longer significant local institutions, let alone with clergy of their own. In addition, 12,500 of them are listed historic buildings. Almost half of all Britain's Grade 1 listed buildings are churches. That is, half the entire store of outstanding historic buildings in England are in this category of either endangered or at-risk buildings. They cannot be demolished or seriously altered. Their owner, that is the Church of England, have a legal duty to keep them in good repair. This is a problem. Empty churches are not meaningless places. I accept that for many people, places of worship carry significance simply by existing. Yet barely 2% of the population worship in a parish church now, down some 30% on the turn of the century. During COVID, the church lost a further 170,000 worshippers who have not returned. The figure is now down to 685,000. More people in England now worship in a mosque than worship in a parish church. More Catholics go to Mass than worship in a parish church. The Bishop of Chelmsford this month pleaded with the C of E to stop being obsessed with numbers. It was an organisation, she said, in panic and fear at being sucked down a plug hole of our own making. But these figures cannot be ignored. Now, plenty of parish churches are doing fine. And I'm not talking about them. I'm talking about the 3,000 to 5,000 which are not doing fine, and many more that conceal their emptiness. My own village in Wales is one of a group of 10 supposedly open churches, all under one vicar. Of these, 2 are reasonably active, 2 are near derelict, and the rest are all but closed. They're like medieval castles. When the communal purpose of such buildings expires, they're ignored and left to disappear. Churches I regard as Britain's defining monuments. They're often the most prominent, the best known, and usually the most beautiful buildings in any landscape or townscape. They and their churchyards form a visual focus of almost every small town or village. Their towers are the signatures of every settlement. They embody its memory, often back to the earliest of times. Throughout history, they've been its shrine, its refuge, its forum, its museum, its place of congregation. But the cost of maintaining these buildings has become crippling. The Church of England's repairs backlog has reportedly reached £1 billion. The average annual cost of church upkeep was put by the Inge report in 2015 at £10,000 a year. It must be double that today. Cathedrals can draw on their tourist popularity and indeed buoyant numbers of worshippers. They appear to have a quite different and, if anything, rising appeal. But fundraising for churches is desperate. Gift box donations are handicapped by the collapse of the cash economy, and funds are crippled by the need to raise diocese and parish share. A church tax, I may say, in reverse. Somehow or other, active churches manage to pay. I repeat, I'm not talking about those who can do. I am talking about those who can't. As a trustee of the CCT, I have to say, there is no more moving activity than our annual tour. While most of our 350 or so churches are in good shape, the most moving, I find, are those on the edge. We visit some that are sustained by just a handful of dedicated volunteers. Last year, one had just a single devoted woman who came alone with her broom each week to give it a good sweep. She was a saint. But I thought, here's an institution that once offered charity and sustenance to an entire village. Now it must rely on one person's charity just to stay open. So where is the solution? It begins with what I regard as a simple necessity. Disused church may look fine from a passing car, but it's an offence to the character and cohesion of its environs. The harm is local, not national. We must find it a new use that enables these buildings somehow to be rebonded with their villages and towns. They are the communities that originally created them and must somehow now take responsibility for them. They just can't be left empty. In 2019, an American company called the Pew Research Center, nothing to do with pews, curiously, looked into the state of Christianity throughout Europe. It found it everywhere in decline. But it also found an overwhelming desire for church buildings to survive, apparently still reflecting their traditional status. Similarly, another survey by the National Churches Trust here found that for all the collapse in church membership, some 3/4 of the public valued the presence of their church in their community. They liked the church as a building, and they recognized its role in social services. Where a church is active, that role can be substantial. The sociologist of religion, Grace Davey, once analysed this response. She wrote that church worship appeared to have mutated from being a culture of obligation and duty, if you remember from our Sunday school days, to a culture of consumption and choice. A church was not a discipline or somewhere where you risk being forced to be a member. It was the opposite. It was a place you might go intermittently, anonymously, when in need of meditation and quiet, a possible refuge in time of emergency. I believe this holds the key to the rising popularity of cathedral visiting. For whatever reason, something deep inside us appears to want these weird old buildings, which mean nothing to most of us, to stick around, with their rooks in the trees and their ghosts in the graveyard. Their old stones seem to reek of eternity. Two conclusions from this, I think, are clear. One is that some new regime must be found for the responsible custodianship of disused parish church buildings. The Church of England cannot undertake this task, aided or unaided. At present it seems frozen in denial. But then it's not a property company, nor is it a heritage organisation. We all know it's famously rich, but it rightly feels its resources are for the promotion of worship, not the upkeep of no longer needed infrastructure. Closed churches must have new owners. And that does not mean guards checking the locks. It means converting them into buildings of use to their communities. I've often thought, this is very controversial, that surely at least the Church of England could do is collaborate with other denominations to keep its buildings in use for all of them. But just try suggesting it. The sad reality is that these buildings need a secular response to what has become a secular challenge, unless someone has a better idea. The second question is, what use is realistic? Time was when reuse could be put in the hands of a national organisation, such as the CCT. This is now absurd. We're talking about thousands of properties, each one crying out not just for repair, not for being looked after, but for innovative leadership that can only be local. Empty churches cannot become a nationalised industry. They're not NHS hospitals or army bases. English Heritage cares for about 400 monuments, but they are inert. We're talking about buildings that we want to fill with people. We want them to come back alive. Their use must respond, I repeat, to local needs. Now, there's no shortage of possible uses for these buildings. Market pressure, stripping villages and town centres of services. They're losing pubs, banks, shops, post offices, cafes, as most have already lost primary schools, clinics, youth clubs and police stations. Over 2,000 pubs have closed since 2017, not because they were unviable, but because their use class is no longer protected and sites are more valuable as houses. Swathes of country are becoming pure dormitories, serviced by the internal combustion engine. The customary institutions of British communities are disappearing, and the reason is weak planning, if not truly irresponsible and socially useless planning. I feel very strongly about this. Yet we might study two ancient cities outside London that had the densest concentration of medieval parish churches some half a century ago. They were Norwich and York, which in the 1950s and 60s both still had 30 to 40 surviving medieval churches each. Their plight was so obvious even then that the Church of England could no longer ignore it. The most determined local effort meant that almost all these churches were not demolished, were eventually found new uses, and are back as part of their communities. In Norwich, it meant an antique shop, an artist studio, a craft centre, an art gallery, a museum, a theatre store, a college building, a counselling centre. York had a counselling centre, a cafe, and a warehouse, that's right. In each case, the initiative was local, and so was the civic benefit. In other words, it can be done. We all know churches where similar initiatives today have borne fruit. They're in the papers every week. They serve as concert halls, bookshops, nursery schools, gyms, even in Primrose Hill, where I used to live, a real ale brewery. Now that there are more food banks in England than McDonald's cafes, hundreds of churches have become distribution centres. Not-for-profit social enterprises have sprung up in churches to answer a local need for a post office, a bank, or a parcels collection centre. A church in Bristol, I think, a CCT church, is a circus training school. Another in Ipswich is a meditation centre. Another in Mayfair is a nightclub. I recall Tamworth Church, still in use for worship, with its west doors thrown open on market day to the market square outside. Its nave was filled with stallholders selling their wares, as they might have done in the Middle Ages. In each case, a church was in some respect reuniting with its community, though except in the case of the Mayfair nightclub, that's a bit far-fetched. But we're talking here of just a tiny fraction of churches, and these reuses almost invariably derive from within an active church community. It lies in bottom-up initiative, enterprise and energy of local supporters, not of some national organisation. The one super-parochial venture I must pay tribute to, I have to say, is the CCT's champing concept. I hope all of you have tried it out. Bed and breakfast in the nave. It's a rare and brilliant case of top-down reform. But for the most part, the fact is that finding new uses requires passionate commitment to what can be a Herculean struggle. Church buildings are not ideally suited for new uses. They were designed for a specific ritual purpose. For many people, these buildings seem austere and foreign. Their imagery is one few Britons any longer are taught at school. Above all, they're very hard to heat. Listed building consent will have to be very flexible in overseeing their reuse. The reality is that almost all these examples are actually in churches that are still used for worship. Wherever I see a new use, I see an active local clergy, volunteers and charities. I'll never forget the multi-purpose, multi-faith restaurant-cum-bookshop that was All Saints Hereford in the 1990s. The vicar was a miniature property magnate, Monkey, I think. I don't know where he is now. Closed churches, by their very nature, miss such people. The fact of their closure suggests they are already devoid of enterprise and friends. Meanwhile, diocesan and bureaucrats and local planners, I hope there are none here, tend to know only one gear, and it's not forward. The planners' chief concern these days, in the case of churches, is for their bats. The conclusion is that rescuing England's closed churches depends not on money. In my view, it depends on heroes. And at present, there are simply not 3,000 heroes to go round. To suppose otherwise is simply to turn our back on the problem. These buildings, and again I'm talking about closed churches, face just three prospects. They can follow medieval castles into progressive dereliction, as ghosts lying at the heart of every community. They can go the way of thousands of Welsh chapels and a number of London churches, be gutted to become houses, albeit not the worst outcome of all. But I believe this is to admit defeat. These buildings should remain in the public domain, at least until all other avenues have been explored. A church is by its nature a public building. Its use should be an expression of local pride and identity. It should therefore pass into the ownership of the community through the relevant local authority. It was communities who erected and paid for these churches down the ages. It is communities who should now own them and be responsible for them. The obvious answer is for the Church of England to divest itself of its closed churches, and possibly many of its almost closed churches, and pass them to the lowest tier of civil authority. In roughly a third of cases, this is the parish council, and in 2/3 it's the urban equivalent, the community, town or city council. Here they would have the same status as a town or village hall, a local museum, a sports club, a park or a garden. The council might then run them itself, or it might pass them to a local trust or a charity. The building would still be subject to historic buildings regulation. It would be like any other local heritage property. But the agency should be local democracy. The future of an unused church building would lie in the hands of those who have most to gain from its future use. Now, the chief deterrent to this is, of course, money. To make such a transfer of responsibility realistic, there must be access to resources. And here I want to step out of the ring for a minute. The identical problem to that which I have been discussing is common in just about every country of Europe. Everybody has lovely old church buildings. The same 2019 Pew report I mentioned above showed a clear desire among European people for their Christian heritage to survive in some built form. In most of these countries, they put their money where their mouth is. They pay some form of church tax. In most cases, it has been accustomed to do so down the centuries, as it was in Britain until 1868. At least 10 governments, Germany, Austria, Switzerland, Denmark, Finland, Sweden, Italy, Portugal, Spain, even Iceland, levy a specific church tax on their citizens. It is on all citizens registered as members of a particular denomination for their baptism, or possibly in the church in which they were married. The church remains on their tax register. In Sweden, Finland, Denmark, and Austria, the tax is small. In Italy, payers who object to paying the tax can write in a preferred charity. In Spain, the money goes to the Catholic Church unless you tick a box, in which case it goes to the state. In Switzerland, the cantons do what they like. In Iceland, the tax can go to the humanists if you tick that box. In most cases, the tax is collected centrally and handed over to the relevant church authority for distribution locally. The fact is that in church-taxing countries, the majority of people do pay money specifically for the upkeep of their churches, even if they never go near them. Clearly, the number of baptized and therefore registered Christians is falling. But the Pew Research records a general support for these taxes. The Danes may be as godless as the Britons, but 80% of Danes do not opt out of the church tax. So Britain is, I think, in a minority of European states that have no historic role of public support for churches. Britain used to have a compulsory church rate, abolished in 1868, but that was after a furious battle, largely with nonconformists. We now know that Britain is not a very advanced country when it comes to constitutional reform, but I think I can confidently say there is no likelihood of any British government introducing a central church tax. If churches had to wait for that, they'll all fall down. However, if parishes and other local councils take on closed or underused churches, they are perfectly free to levy a local precept to pay for their upkeep. This was confirmed last year by determined lobbying, I may say, for an amendment to the Levelling Up Act, effectively reversing the 1868 abolition. The precept could even be voluntary, where a church remains open. Council taxpayers in Britain already are precepted for tax demands for specific purposes, such as the police or the upkeep of sports pavilions or gardens. There's no reason why a precept should not be made for the repair and upkeep of a church building. In normal circumstances, the sum is unlikely to be even in three figures, £50, £90 a year. European evidence is that this would raise some, but not many, objections. All I believe is that it must be possible to rekindle a love for these buildings in those who live near them, especially if this facilitates their reuse. As for that use, clearly a former church should remain in some degree accessible to local people, as was achieved impressively in the cases of York and Norwich. It should be a place of congregation, but that should be for the community to decide, not the central state. Nothing could be worse than the present practice of merely leaving an old building empty. Now, I found the standard response to this is that parish and town councils cannot be trusted with such responsibility. They're not up to it. They would run a mile from it. Yet they own local museums, markets, and sports clubs. Social enterprises now operate in communities across Britain. Charities and trusts can be called in aid. People who care about churches will come forward to run them, as they do across Europe. I simply do not believe Britons are inherently more indolent and uncaring about their local institutions than other Europeans. Of course, there will be exceptions and accidents. Transfer of ownership will not always be straightforward. There will be cases, especially in isolated areas, where parish custody is not feasible. As with any historic building, dereliction may require intervention. A county authority or trust may be required to act. There will, I'm sure, be a continuing need for that great institution, the CCT. But I have to say that whenever I suggest any of this to senior members of the Church of England, they qualify for the Guinness Book of Records with a number of reasons cited as why it can't be done. Half Europe has solved the same problem that appears to be defeating us. Yet we are too arrogant or too narrow-minded even to go and see how they do it. We must vest these buildings in our communities. We must seek solutions, not just catalogue objections. My reform would liberate a hard-pressed Church of England from the ever heavier burden of its heritage. I long only for just one diocese to pick up this challenge. It would revive the image of the local church from one of emptiness and gloom to one of activity and light. And it would incidentally help revive that once great British institution, the local parish. Thank you very much.
Simon said so many wonderful and interesting things that one could pick up on. I like the bit about bringing back activity and light. And this is what I always say when people ask me what the CCT does. It's about bringing activity back into these wonderful, wonderful places. We can't do it everywhere. The Church of England won't be able to do it everywhere. I like the idea from, can't remember where it came from in the audience, about finding some pilots where we could actually get a local community, a parish council that was actually prepared to levy a precept to try and make this happen. Now, we've got plenty of ideas in the CCT about how you can actually enliven a church, how you can bring this activity and light back. Simon's quite right, we only have 358. But we're very proud of what we managed to do in those 358. The Circus School, by the way, in Bristol, is in a church that is still consecrated. All our churches are still consecrated, but they can still be homes to an amazing amount of activity. We, of course, also worry about conserving the fabric of them. You know, that was why they were given to us in the first place, because they are of such architectural merit that they should be preserved for the nation. And we have a wonderful team at the CCT who work very, very hard to keep our churches in good shape. Not surprisingly, there's always a deficit. There's always more that we could spend to improve their condition, but we think we do a pretty good job with what we've got. Now, this is the bit you won't be surprised that I'm going to talk about. We are beneficiaries of money from DCMS. We're a bit worried about next week, but we're keeping our fingers crossed. We're beneficiaries of funds from the C of E. We'd like some more. Every time I see people from the C of E, I do mention this. But we also rely hugely on the generosity of our supporters from events like tonight. We've moved into the 21st century, and you can actually do giving with a credit card. I think there's a machine over there somewhere. I hope it's working. We're equally in the 21st century with a URL. You can actually pick up this leaflet on your seat and make a donation. But we'd like you, those of you who don't already, we'd like you to join us and visit our churches and actually help us bring this more activity and light into them. So I'm not going to say any more about that for the moment. The last thing I'm going to say is reiterate thanks to Simon. Simon has been a trustee for nearly 9 years. Sadly, we can't keep our trustees for longer than that, and we'll be saying goodbye to him in January, and he will be a huge loss. But, and I suspect he knows this, we're trying to work on ways in which we can keep him closely connected with us, because he's been such a huge supporter, and he's a great person to have on our side. I bought Simon's book many years ago, and The 1,000 Best Churches, by the way, and we don't keep it on the bookshelf. Whenever we go anywhere, we have it in the back of the car, because you can always find somewhere interesting to go to. So for those of you who haven't got Simon's book, you can purchase a copy tonight and he will sign it for you. So this is a great opportunity. So I'd like to invite you all to stay on and have a glass of wine with us. I'd like to thank you all for coming again, and I'd like you just once more to thank our great speaker, and of course Victoria.